Thank you. I'm Seamus Hegarty, University of Warwick. You've all talked about a focus on equity. Will this lead to some explicit emphasis on kids with disabilities?
Okay. Any further ones across here, Ian? We're going to keep you fit.
Thanks very much. Spiros Thamadlis, University of East Anglia. There is quite a lot of emphasis on equity and equality. Is there any scope for kind of reversing this relationship from the West, to the rest, and learning, from the rest?
Okay, thank you. The third one? Okay, let's go with those two. Are you all looking excited here? Stefan, do you want to start us off? Or you may pass to your colleagues if you wish.
Yeah, sure. Let me briefly comment on disability. The minister that actually looks after the work on education, Lynn Featherstone, she's actually made it this explicit condition that we have to really make sure that issues to do with disability actually feature in all these calls. Now, of course, in the different calls, it has different elements. Some of the work we do with ESRC, this is still going to be kind of call it a supply-driven, calls come in, proposals come in, but I'm pretty sure one way or another this will be clarified as something that can earn some brownie points in it. In our systems work, we definitely will encourage that in some of these countries that actually is getting quite a lot of attention. And this is actually not just because our ministers want us to do, but also because we can increasingly see that on the learning outcomes that the correlation with children with disabilities in various forms is actually quite important. So it's becoming an emerging bigger issue also in our own work.
Okay. Any of the other panel members? Harry, did you want to comment?
Yes, just on the question about disabilities, definitely an area that we want to look in, and hopefully the research proposals will address this. In terms of SABRE, one of the new domains that we're developing now is called equity and inclusion, and we hope to advance the disability in that domain as it gets developed. On learning from the South, I guess, I think one of the best examples of rigorous evidence and policy has been the conditional cash transfer program, which started in Mexico and Brazil, and through rigorous impact evaluations has been replicated to 27 countries last time I checked, including New York City and Australia. So I think that's one example of learning from the so-called developing world.
Okay, thank you. Jordan.
On the disability question, UNICEF has the multi-indicator cluster survey, and that did not in the past have any focus on disability. But we are in the process of developing a disability module, working with the Washington Group and a few other partners. So hopefully in the next round, or at least piloted, it will be piloted in the next round of the mix survey.
Okay. Yes, do go ahead.
I think, is it?
Yeah, it should be on.
Okay, so I just wanted to add a couple of things, just very briefly on disability. I think within our education program is still an emerging area, but we will, I think, see more and more of that kind of mainstreamed in, especially our reading work. I do want to mention we have a couple of things that we support from the first round of our Education Grand Challenge, which is kind of like an innovation fund, and it's really focused on kind of looking for innovation using technology, new methods, and learning about how to address these really deep issues. And so we support a number of grantees that are looking at supporting reading for blind children in developing countries for which are very, very few resources or any attention paid to. We also have some work being done around assessing incoming students to diagnose, to identify learning disorders. Again, it's an area that is just not paid any attention to in a lot of the countries we work with. So we have it's new and it's emerging, but I think you'll see more of it in our portfolio. And then just on that, I wanted to mention on learning from the West, because they're just learning from, I don't want to call it the rest, learning from, but I just want to mention a couple of things. One, there are some amazing models of learning that have come from, and I want to mention, I'll point out Pratham's model out of India, which is kind of community-based, voluntary-based. You could call it remedial or accelerated, but just an incredible model with a lot of evidence around it, and we're seeing that replicated in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries. And this is something that's just really, it's been just a fundamental kind of learning for all of us, and that has come out of India. And as well, I mentioned the importance of assessment for us. There have been a lot of household community-based assessments spearheaded by ASER and then adapted in East Africa with AWESO. And these are really, these are homegrown kinds of things that have a lot of civil society engagement, very grassroots. And we've learned a lot from that as well. So.
Okay, thank you. Next questions? Okay, Ian, there's a lady across that way. And there's a lady just in the middle as well. So yes, do go ahead and he'll move across.
Sharjah Fennell, University of Cambridge. In keeping with the theme of equity, to what extent is there an explicit recognition at the moment of non-formal schooling? Schooling in the community, particularly thinking from the development angle with relation to child labour, with the kind of things that Harry was talking about in Vietnam. The extent to which alternative systems, and if we're getting to the sharp edge, then what about religious education? Is there a role to learn from, say, madrasa education that's critically evaluated? Do we have that kind of space? Is this truly going to be looking at heterogeneity? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And lady across there, yes.
Thanks, Elaine Unterholter from the Institute of Education here in London. I guess the questions about how education systems are being conceived and the place of higher education, because I thought it was interesting that the ESRC presented higher education and then education for development as though they were kind of separate tranches. And it's a matter of regret that the MDG program left out higher education. So it's really to hear from everyone on the panel what's the place and the kind of joined upness with higher education.
Okay, and there's a gentleman just in front, so you don't have to go too far.
I'm Ben Posadam-Halls from the Association of Commonwealth Universities. I'm very interested in the answer to the previous question as well. And I was going to ask something similar, but I might ask something slightly different instead. I was wondering if the panel could comment on their approaches to and strategies for the uptake and use of the research that they're funding. I mean, I'm assuming that all the research will inform your funding programs. But in particular with the programs that DFID and ESRC were talking about, and Stephanie, in particular, I think you mentioned that research will be focused on a small number of countries where you hope that the outcomes of that research will be used. I was wondering what your strategy was there for ensuring that will happen, and what involvement, if any, the ministries of education in those particular countries will have in the process, and whether they'll have any say in the selection of the projects you fund, and how you work with them to ensure that the results of that research will actually impact on policies in country.
Okay, thank you. 3 quite different questions. I'll move on. We'll have another tranche. I'm ever so weak. Take the microphone and just add to the higher education one. And then we'll move on to the panel.
Mine continues to be on higher education with
Okay.
the ESCR. My question is to do with higher education in developing countries. Are you partnering with some of the universities in developing countries? Because I have just come back from Kenya, and I know of some universities that are doing a lot of work, that's the business, their MBAs, with people in the slum areas and helping them to work on their business projects and bringing people out of the slum areas. And this would be really very interesting to me of how we could support them if you are interested in that.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I'm going to start with you on the higher education, seeing as it's the
Yes.
hottest topic.
Okay, yes, happy to talk about that. I think I had 4 questions. So just very quickly on the first one about non-formal schooling and so on, I see no reason at all why that shouldn't be part of the programme. The first call is on effective teaching that we've talked about, and of course there's a very interesting debate there about the best model and ways of practices. So remember that for a lot of these calls we're really expecting the academics to come up with the bright ideas, tell us when we should be thinking about learning from the rest. You know, these sorts of things are the type of thing we encourage in these calls. So we will be looking to you to tell us that these are really important topics for us to address, and that's the nice element of the nature of the sorts of calls that we put together with DFID, I think. As far as higher education, yes, I mean, please don't get me wrong if I presented it incorrectly. We have made a decision that we think in the UK context, and by that I mean UK and probably more developed countries context, we think there's a need for more research on higher education. We're not going to, of course, stop funding work on other forms of education when people come to us for grants in our responsive modes and so on, but we think there is a particular need for higher education research in those contexts. As far as the developing countries' research portfolio is concerned, though, we're perfectly happy for that to include higher education as well. So that can cover education across the piece. So in this case, we're not restricting it to higher education. I'm part of a group actually set up by DFID, which is talking now about, you know, DFID's expectations for future research in higher education. So I know that DFID is also very interested actually in higher education in developing countries. So I don't think you should be worried at all. I think we'd be very open to ideas on higher education. As far as getting the research outcomes used, I may even turn to you to talk about ministries and how we might get involved with those. But don't forget that in everything we fund, we expect people to demonstrate in their impact assessment when they put the application in how they imagine the work that they're going to be doing will have impact and how it will be taken up. And you'll see in the call, if you read it in detail, that we are talking about wanting people to engage with the systems that they're studying to try and think about how those new findings might be embedded. So I think that's certainly going to be part of the outcome. As far as partnering with universities in other countries, again, see no reason against that at all. We're very, very keen to have partnerships in the applications that come through. And in fact, in my opinion, the applications will be highly strengthened by having probably a range of different stakeholders, but including universities and others as part of those teams.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And if I'm right, developing countries can actually lead on those bids. It doesn't have to be a UK-led bid.
I should probably clarify that, because for those of you who are used to getting funding from ESRC, if you come to ESRC, you do have to be a UK researcher. That's one of the rules usually. But in this programme, you can be from anywhere in the world, and that can include collaborations led by countries in the south, countries in the north. It doesn't matter. This is wide open.
Okay, thank you. Stefan.
Yes, and maybe just start where Paul left it, is that, you know, that's the general rule in DFID research funding now, that it's you know, just as no aid is ever tied from the UK, it is also for research calls, it's never tied to UK institutions, so it's always open. And indeed, we always try to work actively on reducing the barriers of entry into these markets, essentially, come from developing countries, and it's something we definitely are making progress on, and we could do quite a lot more. Actually, just to take the point on the policy influence and the expectations on impact. Okay, so as a researcher who has been on the receiving end of DFID contracts in the past before I joined DFID, you know, the requirements are very strict, and I'm very conscious that often for researchers it's actually pretty hard to be able to get that influencing chain properly set up and making actually the impact. And so it's something also from within DFID. We actively try to think about how can we actually improve that. It's very easy for us to say to the researcher especially in of course, example, when we work with the ESRC, okay, let them judge them on how much impact they will have. And we have to be very careful, because you know, sitting in a development ministry, quite a lot of research I don't really want necessarily immediate impact on policy, because, you know, the research may be very good but maybe only a part of the picture, and if they act on that, it may actually not necessarily be the priority that needs to be done in a place. So there's a really interesting, difficult balance in terms of trying to achieve impact. So it's something we try to do. So in these calls, when we work with ESRC, we will try to very strongly encourage that people, work with local partners, have a sensible idea of how they could influence. And I think it is a responsibility increasingly, not least when we're working with DFID money, for people to do this. Something that people sometimes forget: when DFID put money into research, this is public money given to us to, in principle, acting in line with the International Development Act, which means we have to alleviate extreme poverty, which is maybe different to say we put money into fundamental research. So our responsibility with this money, this is not just research money, this is actually money that otherwise are not spent directly in getting kids into schooling programs. So we have to think about it. So anyway, so that's that part, and we keep on pushing it. That's also when we come to this kind of more complicated research I was talking about, the systems research, that we increasingly also try to find models where we are facilitating and helping and putting some effort in making sure that the links with governments, the users of this research, are established quite early on. And if this is kind of a complicated structure of procuring a big research project, it's partly also to ensure that. One of the directions, one of the pressures we have, and I think our ministers are right, is actually being increasingly a bit skeptical about some of the research, because, what is it actually doing for the actions on the ground? What is it actually doing for these ministries in that respect? So increasingly we're looking for models that can actually have, to some extent, that are demand driven, that are answering the questions that are actually relevant within this context. But we do never want to jeopardize the rigor and the high quality of this work. We don't want to turn research into consultancy work that just gives the answer that the minister at that moment in charge wants to hear, which I'm sure all familiar with. So finding some of these kind of, the balance there is actually, it's very hard. What we've done, and it's actually quite a very timely question, what we've done, it was coincidentally a few days ago, was the World Education Forum, and I sat in some meetings with some of the ministers of developing countries that are actually visiting. There were 80 ministers of education in London, and several of them actually we had bilateral meetings with our ministers. And in fact, our minister asked them whether they wanted to participate in some of these programs. And indeed, some countries, sure I can name without any jeopardizing anything, like sat in meetings with the Ethiopian and the Ugandan education minister, and both said, that sounds really interesting, and please talk to us and help us. So this is the idea and the intention is to see whether we can actually work in these particular countries then, help to facilitate the researchers to have some access. But, it's still politics there. The minister may go and you may start a research program and it's the wrong minister in charge after all. We can't guarantee it. But at least we can build the processes and the links with education ministers in that respect, also for researchers.
Okay, thank you. Harry or Christine, do you want to answer any of those particular questions? Don't feel you have to answer them all.
Just a couple of words on the question of equity and non-formal or alternative models. One of the windows in the education CEF is the non-state basic education, which would include low-cost private schools, religious, if that was the provider. And we have one of the evaluations that in the last round was a program in Romania for Roma children to receive incentives to participate in preschool education.
So I just wanted to mention briefly, on the uptake and use of evidence, I mean, it's a critical issue, even with our own agency, and I know from talking to other donors, it's a constant challenge, both in terms of looking at the standards and norms and what, kind of what constitutes enough evidence for what purpose, and then also taking the next step and bringing that discussion to the country level and with our host country partners. One model I wanted to share, which we've done in partnership with the Global Partnership for Education, is we've held 3 regional workshops where we bring together other donors we're working in the country, local education stakeholders, and ministry representatives together to talk about what does the evidence look like in reading in particular. How does that map to their local context? A lot of the kind of experts that we bring in are from those contexts, from the developing country, who are doing like groundbreaking work in these areas. And so that's, I think, been a really effective, focused way to do that. We're able to do it because it's a narrow focus on reading, so it's effective in that modality. But I think it's actually a really great model. And then there's also a lot of cross-country sharing as well as they develop and look at developing reading programs. There's a lot of opportunities for countries to share where they're at in the process. And then I just want to mention on the alternative systems, there's a lot of really interesting emerging models. Pakistan is a good example with affordable private schools, which are truly affordable, and are addressing some of the equity and equality issues. And so we're studying those models and looking at where those models might be relevant in other contexts where the system, the public system right now just can't support the needs for whatever reasons. So,
Okay, thank you. One last round. Oh my goodness, they've just got going now. Okay, gentleman at the back and then the lady.
Abdul Hassar, University of Cambridge. So in education, we often talk about things like inclusivity, in international development, we talk about participation, cooperation. So if I went to a school, and also I think many educationists will recognize that question, well, who's the best teacher in this school? That's a sort of an ill-posed question. There isn't a best teacher. It's about different things in education. I was just wondering whether some of the very competitive, specifically with a DFID problem, whether some of the very competitive approaches are really the best approaches to have an impact on the ground, to have these programs procured in this very kind of competitive ways, rather than trying to think about the things that we advocate in country about inclusion and participation and so forth. Just wondering, I mean, it's a very overarching question and perhaps difficult to answer, but I just thought I'd ask that.
Okay, thank you. Lady in front.
I'm Alison Joyner from the Aga Khan Foundation, which is an NGO. We're based out of Switzerland. All the speakers rightly highlighted the importance of improved learning outcomes and focusing on assessments of those outcomes, which nobody would dispute. And I was happy to see in the DFID ESRC call, which is actually on the ESRC website already, that there's a strong focus on mixed research methods, so we can complement the quantitative outcomes with the qualitative ones, because I think we need to highlight the importance of learning from the bad results to try to understand what they tell us about why the system isn't working and how we can build on that. So if we're finding bad results in our impact evaluations, we need to try to learn from that, and one of the best ways to do that is to interview people, talk to people, try to find out in qualitative ways. So I'm hoping that this will be the trend for these new research methods, because the new research calls, because this is slightly is in contradiction to our experience as an implementation agency for a particular Girls' Education Challenge project in one country, and I won't mention the country, but the fact is that we're being asked to implement in a very an evaluation policy in a very rigorous semi-RCT approach. Being payment by results is our part of the basis of our agreement with the same donor.
Okay, thank you.
So the question is, can we be confident that mixed methods are really what you're looking for?
Okay, I'm going to take those two and then come to the next two. Okay, anybody want to reply to either of those two? The competitive question, mixed learning. Paul?
Yes, I'll take the second one first. Mixed research methods, absolutely. We strongly support vast, big quantitative studies, small-scale qualitative studies, and those studies in between that integrate both. Obviously, there's a whole range of questions where mixed methods are actually the optimum approach, in my view, but often it's not as simple as just saying mixed methods is going to solve the problem. But I absolutely agree that that sort of methodology is absolutely fine, and we'll encourage that throughout. On the first one, I'm not sure I entirely understood where you're going. If what you're saying is we shouldn't base it on the sort of most excellent science and the highest quality peer review, well, sorry, that's what we do. Is that where you...
You know, you can have a degree of competition between those. But I think, do we really have that much of a global community of educationalists working on these problems that one shouldn't think about an approach that sort of goes through think tanks, identifying the right strategies, just being more upfront in your application process? I mean, you know, we might be advocating open education, but the proposals we write are tightly guarded. And sort of, you know, I mean, we share ours, but often they are tightly guarded. And I think there could be other approaches that take a more kind of iterative, agile, participatory approach that but identify with the stakeholders the right elements that we need to focus on.
I know Stefan's bursting to say something. Maybe you should pass to him.
But I'm losing enthusiasm. Sorry. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure where you're going with some of that. I will, echo first of all what Paul says. You do look for excellence in research, and you do. But of course, the way we try to structure some of these kind of calls is that the way we want to evaluate who we actually are going to allocate funding to for researching a particular problem, they have to get a sense, not just that they have the strongest CV and then therefore they get anything. They have to come with good ideas that are relevant, that make sense. In the work we do, we encourage very strongly that I work with local partners. When we come to, for example, the systems work, they will have to actually be able to show that the way they think and the way they will operate in implementing their research over multiple years, that they have a model that will include and that will listen, that will iterate with the stakeholders in government, in the schools and so on, to actually, because that's the only way to get impact. And so they have to have a credible case. So it's not simply asking, is your research proposal, not least when it's coming to do with our money, that actually impact is crucial. Will your research proposal be published in the top journal in education, and is it the person with the biggest CV that gets it? No, that's not just it. It's actually we were trying to get research that is of the highest quality, but that actually engages with the questions that we're trying to ask.
I think that's absolutely right, and exactly that point. We certainly encourage people to engage with other stakeholders. So do team up with, if you think think tanks or other organisations are the right organisations to be involved. No harm at all in those being involved in proposals. We're very happy to have consortiums coming together. We do, of course, in some of the schemes that we run, have different approaches. So on occasion, we do run competitions where we bring everyone together in a room and we get them all to talk about their ideas and sort of throw ideas around. It depends on the topics that we're dealing with. This one has a particular set routine. It's not to constrict it, exactly as we just heard. We're not saying that if you aren't the best publisher in this country, there's no point in applying. Obviously, we expect you to have a credible, strong academic record, but it's the quality of the research you're proposing to do will be the fundamental thing. We fund a lot of young researchers as well as more mature researchers. We fund lots of people from different backgrounds, and it's based on the quality of the application that comes in.
Okay, thank you. Harry and Kristin, any comments on those two?
I think I agree with what I heard, and just wanted to mention that in our call for proposals, of course, we're looking for a strong identification strategy, but we also give credit where the proposal includes researchers from the countries in question, where there's a strong dissemination program in country, and we have a very strong capacity building program that's present in all the countries where we award the funding. It's a separate program, part of the CEIF. In our SABRE work, of course, we're looking for collaboration in country with the government partners, of course, but also other institutions. And mixed research, in my opinion, the best impact evaluations we've seen have applied some measure of mixed research.
I think, and just to echo what Harry said, you'll find in a lot of our solicitations the emphasis on the local partner, building capacity, research capacity, engaging with stakeholders to set the research agenda, not just kind of respond to and be part of it. And that's a really critical piece. And I think in terms of the methods, yeah, I mean, the RCTs that have the qualitative, that kind of unpack, that black box and get you some transparency around why, it got the kind of outcomes are really critical. Looking at incentive systems and how, the interventions linked with the rest of the system, some things you can't see when you're just looking at like an effect size. So absolutely, yeah.